I've given all of you some feedback on what you submitted. And so at this point, now the goal is to think about the sampling and the method for collecting data and start brainstorming as much as you can about how you would design a adequate sample and what data collection method you might use. Think about whether it's an experiment or single-subject design or survey or some combination of that, whether it's quantitative or qualitative. And to the extent you can think about very specific things you would measure as inputs and outputs and outcomes, that would be great. That's showing you kind of understand what's going on. And so this proposal that you're writing is the same format as we do for any kind of proposal. And proposal is just that. It's an idea for how you would collect data. And what you need to know for your quiz is that the proposal doesn't have findings. It doesn't have results. Okay? Proposal has generally 4 or 5 sections, but there is no findings section. There is no results because it's just proposing. It's not actually doing. Other than that, proposals and research papers are basically the same thing in the sense that the literature review is the same, the methods is the same. It's just in a paper, then you have the results from what you collected versus a proposal, you have yet to collect the results. And for this class, it's just a thinking exercise. So what you see on the screen right now is an example paper. Oh, I got to share my screen for the online student. This one. Okay, good. And so this one's about what are the factors behind disproportionate medication among foster children in Texas, right? And so they start off with some statistics about foster children and medication. And so this is good. And in this case, it's the same as what was in the proposal, which is fine. And we're citing our source. You don't have to, it's best if you rewrite and don't use quotes, but sometimes I understand it's hard to do that. And so basically setting up the background and how important this issue is in the background section. Literature review, just slight continuation about that, a little bit about how other people have studied this topic, and this is where you're looking at your 3 articles. You can think about what methods other people have used to explore your topic before. And then the research question that you're asking. So you guys have all gotten past that point of what is the research question you're asking. And then from that point, it's all showing that you picked up on key ideas in the class. This one talks about human subjects consideration. That's actually not a required heading, but it's fine. You want to talk about the IRB and how the IRB would be involved. And then the methods. And so here in the methods, you want to use as many keywords as you can think of that we talked about in the PowerPoint that relate to how you would theoretically collect data. And so think about what's the right tools and what's the right sampling approach. Sampling is big, and it's just theoretical of how you would find people to ask the appropriate questions or test the intervention with. So think about the different stakeholders that are part of your question and what methods, what questions you might use to do that, and then the limitations. Very helpful to think about how, there's always going to be some limitation. And this person went on to talk about internal and external validity as one way to analyze that. And then you don't need much of a conclusion because it's just a proposal. Okay, so for your quiz, there's no findings, no results in a proposal. And one of the questions is pretty tricky. It says that there's asking you, there's a lot of different sections in a research proposal, and according to your book, no, there's only 4 or 5 sections in a proposal. And the outline for the final paper, this lists a few, not as many as in the question. Okay, so and we're thinking about what is, so when we think about your quiz, think about what is the goal of research, And the goal of research, of course, is to discover something, right? But it's also to communicate that discovery. So just be aware that the goal of research is not just to discover, but also to communicate that discovery to a larger audience. Because if you don't disseminate the result, it may not be of any value. Then the question in there about how many sections there are in a research proposal, just know normal is like 4 or 5 sections, okay? Anything beyond that, you could have some subheadings, but you don't need more than 4 or 5 sections in a proposal. And the book talks a little bit about who decides what gets published. Any of you guys have any sense of who decides what gets published and what doesn't? The story is a little bit different. You could write your own book, right, and self-publish it on Amazon. You could do that. But typically, the major books, there's an editor that decides who gets involved in that book. And so for textbooks and the like, there's generally 1 or 2 editors, and then those editors can decide who's qualified to write. But for journals, which are more current in the sense that it's very recently submitted work, the professional editor isn't the final decision maker. They're the decisions made by a group of peer reviewers. And so you might hear about this idea of peer review, and that's a big part of academics, and this idea that things should be reviewed by your peers. So other experts in the field, that is your peers. Okay, so as far as what is social work research, what qualifies, peer review is the way that works, and our professors are required to publish in those peer-reviewed journals. People like me are reviewers. I get requests all the time to review other people's work, and then usually 3 to 5 people are reviewing it, and the editor decides finally, based on suggestion of the reviewers, whether or not to publish. So remember that professional editor isn't the one that ultimately selects. It's the peer reviewers. Next, the quiz is talking about what's in the body of the paper, and the body of the paper should have an introduction that presents the specific problem and highlights why the study is important and describes the research strategy. So, body paper is basically like your final paper. You're going to talk about the scope, why it's a big problem, and the research strategy. In the book, they talk about proposals and the different sections, and know that the different sections are, like, there's a literature review where you're describing the background. There's a methodological plan where you're describing the methods that would be used, whether it's a survey, or interviews, experiment, that kind of idea. And in most proposals, you actually have a budget, because most proposals are for funding. It's not just, do you have permission to do it, but will the government give you money to do so? So most proposals actually have a budget. You're not required to make up a budget for this, because they just decided that wasn't part of this. But that's often tricky, because you're just guessing how much it's going to cost to pay the people that would be involved, and or like that. But that's an important part of real professional proposals, is deciding the cost. And then we need to describe the limitations. So the statement of limitations. So for the question on the quiz, remember that proposals don't have a findings section, okay? Proposals don't need to have the actual findings or results, because it's just proposing the idea. And then in the research proposal, you have a section where you're talking about how what you're doing builds on what's already been done, and that's the literature review. Okay, so the literature review is providing context what other people have already done, and ideally what you're doing builds on what other people have already done. And the next quiz question is really tricky. And this is the idea about what's not in an academic journal. And so academic journals, they're always going to have an introduction, like you guys write. They're always going to have samples and measures. They're going to have results. They're going to have a discussion. And they have an abstract. Abstract is just the brief, like 4 sentences about it. But they don't have an executive summary. Okay, so write this down. They don't have an executive summary. They have all the sections except an executive summary. An executive summary is like a full page long description, more detailed than the abstract. So basically, executive summary is something done in the real world for leaders of an organization to get a kind of detailed sense, more detailed than an abstract would be, but we don't publish those in journals because it's too much effort. You might as well read the whole thing. All right. Okay, and then this is tricky. We can describe the kind of we're going to do a survey using the PHQ-9 and the GAD-6 and different tools in our survey, but then sometimes we show the actual questions asked, the actual survey, in the appendix of the paper, right? So the paper usually just describes in general terms what we use, but the actual specific questions, that's going to be in the appendix. Okay, so write that down. And actually, this is in journal articles, or art isn't often in an appendix, but applied research reports. So something where you're doing a program evaluation and you're giving a report on that evaluation. It's often longer, and you want to give every document that you have, and documents that are really detailed go in the appendix. Oh, okay. There's a question on here about the whole research process and what's the part of the process. And so when we're writing a process, you're going to, when you're writing up the final report on a study, typically we'll write a major report for the funding agency or the leader of the agency that allowed us to conduct the data collection, and provide them a lot of details on what we found. And when we do that, we give them detailed notes. We often use some kind of a word processing program to type it up. And we often seek constructive criticism from others before we complete it. And we have an outline for the report. However, it's one of these tricky questions that asks what's not a good idea. And what's not a good idea is waiting till the end of the process to begin editing your report. And the idea is you can start, writing the report, something that in a qualitative context you do step by step, and you go back and edit it iteratively, constantly trying to improve it. So anyways, it's one of these questions where what is not a good idea and what's not a good idea is waiting until the end to begin editing your report. It's going to often require a lot of back and forth. And finally, it asks about in a research proposal, where do you detail the methods and the design and the sample and the measures? And that's in the methodology section. Quiz refers to it as the methodological plan. Typically, we would just say methods, but anyways, it's the methodological plan that we talk in detail about the design and measures and such. So that's it. With that, you are ready for the final quiz, and you have some sense of how to write your final paper. In the sense, you're just going to try and share as many key ideas from this class as they relate to how you would find a sample and collect information from that sample. It need not be particularly long. 7 to 10 pages is good. Borrowing from your proposal is fine, because that was just the background section. Essentially, you might provide a little, for those of you that wrote a really short research question, you'll need to add some literature review, but a few of you wrote much longer literature reviews, so you don't need to change anything. So any questions? If you haven't turned in your proposal, please let me know, and I can work it out with you verbally. We can get that done. That's for the next 2 weeks or so. That's your mission, to finish the final paper, this quiz. When we meet next time, we can start talking about the final exam in more detail, but it's just a very, everything the second half of the class, questions very similar to what have been on your quizzes, same concepts. All right. That's it.